Welcome to the fourth Arabian Sea Dialogue. This dialogue is being co-hosted by ORF and the Arab Planning Institute. Under the Arabian Sea Dialogue series, we have hosted three other such meetings. The first one was on culture and cricket, a second one on fourth industrial revolution and the future of work, the third one on Bahrain-India economic relations. This fourth dialogue is on India-GCC, prospects for post-pandemic trade and economic cooperation. Our attempt with these dialogues is to develop a better understanding of policy priorities of nations in the Gulf and to explore how India's relations with the Gulf can be strengthened. Our goal is also to build linkages with think tanks and policy research institutions and policy experts in the Gulf. And therefore, we are delighted to have the Arab Planning Institute as a partner with us. On behalf of ORF, I'm thankful to Professor Belkacem and his team for coordinating this event. I'm grateful to Dhaval Desai, my colleague from ORF Mumbai, for coordinating on behalf of ORF Mumbai. I now invite Professor Belkacem to give his opening remarks and moderate the discussion. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Let me first express my deep gratitude to ORF and API teams who worked hard to organize such an important event that marks the beginning of a collaboration between API and ORF to promote the Indo-Gulf ties, cooperation and dialogue. A word on API. API is an independent Arab institution specialized in the issue of economic and social development of Arab countries. Through providing training programs, consultancy, and engage actively in applied and economic, financial, social research, as well as organizing events that help disseminate economic knowledge and encourage dialogue with different stakeholders and societies at large. Today, the world is facing two major challenges that are impacting the life and livelihood of mankind. The challenges are COVID-19 and climate change. COVID has already claimed the death of almost 5 million people, and climate change impacts on planet Earth are becoming a reality. The whole world is trying to face both challenges by implementing containment and vaccination measures and through economic support policies in order to control the spread of the virus. Many countries are announcing net zero policies by 2050 to mitigate the climate change effect. The economies of both India and GCC were hit hard by COVID-19 during 2020. However, both economies are expected to grow strongly during the 2021-22. This is helped by putting early containment measures, strong recovery policy, and large vaccination campaign. The recent rally of energy prices in international markets is a further boost to GCC economies. India and GCC are both large economic blocs. GDP of India is estimated around 2.6 trillion and that of GCC around $1.5 trillion. Given the historical ties between India and GCC, trade flows are estimated around 120 billion. Investment flows and remittances are also important vectors of bilateral economic cooperation. India and GCC economic ties are expected to strengthen further given their economic policy that are based on enhancing economic growth through trade and investment and technology. For GCC countries, diversifying away from hydrocarbons is the only guarantee to face zero net carbon policy that are expected to gain momentum in the future to face climate change. India also is looking to expand trade and investment to sustain development. Both have vested interest to tap opportunities and build competitive advantage. It must be a win-win strategy. I am sure that the selected panel of eminent experts in the GCC India are well aware of the potentiality and the challenges facing both India and GCC, and we look forward to hearing from them a deep discussion of the issue related to post-COVID economic challenges and opportunities, and issues are related to trade and investment. So, now we start with the discussion. We have a very distinguished panel, and as we agreed, we will start with the COVID recovery policies. We have from the Indian side, Dr. Ila Patnaik, and from the GCC side, Dr. Abdulaziz Sagar. I will start with Dr. Ila Patnik to give her contribution. You have about 7 to 10 minutes, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Belkacem. And thank you very much to ORF for inviting me on this forum. To begin with a brief background, many of you might be, of course, familiar with that background, but basically, I just want to start with a very two-line background that India was hit very badly, particularly in the second wave of COVID. So while in the after the first wave, the economy was hit very badly, when we saw a decline in GDP of about 24%. And then in the second wave, when the new variant of COVID came, then while vaccinations were going on, we saw a large number of deaths. And at that time, it seemed so gloomy. It seemed like we're, really going to be in the depths of this for a very long time. But fortunately, and it was, a surprise to many of us, fortunately, what we saw was that even though the economy had actually contracted in the first wave, in the second wave, there was no contraction. We grew, we were expanding. Yes, growth was slow, but it has been positive growth all the way along. And it's very encouraging, particularly in the last 2 months or so. In the last 2 months, India has started seeing an expansion of jobs in some of the sectors which are quite labor intensive, like construction, hospitality, retail, travel, where there had been a very sharp contraction of jobs. Even in the second wave of COVID, we have now started seeing job openings come up. Of course, software, which, globally, there's a global software boom now, thanks to people like us. We're all on Zoom, and we're all using software far more intensively than we were in the past. And India obviously benefits from a software boom, given that it's one of our major exports and our strengths. But apart from that, domestically, we are seeing a sharp recovery in many sectors. People's willingness to come out today's news was very encouraging. That is that the business confidence that had fallen very sharply has now come back. At the same time, we are now seeing consumer confidence come back. While we saw that, even though jobs had started coming back in the last 2 months or so, we had not really seen consumer confidence come up. Maybe it was because wages were still low. And particularly in the, large informal sector where people, unskilled labor, and people work at very low wages. Even there, we are now seeing some positive improvement in wages. So the news from the domestic front is currently looking quite good. Of course, there are huge challenges. And, after that background, we are here to talk about what are some of the major challenges that we expect to face in this COVID recovery period, in this post-pandemic period. One of the things that is really still hitting us is supply constraints, logistics. International trade has been disrupted, shipping has been disrupted, a lot of our imports have been disrupted. And because, today it's a very globalized world, and we depend a lot on imports for some of our exports as well as some of the domestic products that are sold. So, for example, whether you want to buy cars or whether you want to buy UPVC windows, there are long queues because of huge supply chain disruptions that have happened. So the first and immediate challenge that we face is how are we going to cope with these supply chain disruptions? They are causing price increases in many in many markets, there is price increase. How should policy respond? Should there be restrictions on prices, or should there be caps? Should there be reductions in excise duty, for example, or reductions in the GST rate? Should there be intervention by the government at all, or should one just wait it out and try to see where prices go? Should the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank that is charged, whose mandate is to control inflation, should that be responding to these supply constraints and issues in inflation arising from supply constraints or not? So that's one big challenge. To some extent, the last 2 months have been positive in terms of consumer price inflation. And, we had seen a long period when consumer price inflation had been higher than the Reserve Bank of India's target of 6%. But now that has also, for the last 2 months, consumer price inflation has come down. But that is one of the biggest risks that we see looking forward. So with that, I come to the second big challenge, and that is, how are we going to address economic policy, macro policy in this world today, where, the developed countries have done huge fiscal and monetary expansion. In fact, if I think of the real interest rate in the US, then with a 0% real interest rate and a 5% inflation rate, with a 0% nominal interest rate and a 5% inflation rate, you effectively have a negative real interest rate in the US. So, and that is very expansionary. Fiscal policy has been hugely expansionary, and all that is pushing up consumer demand in the US. And the US consumption demand-led global markets are responding by an increase in prices. How are we going to deal with it? For us, it is a lot of imported inflation. Of course, there's also oil prices, who again, for us, oil prices are an imported inflation. So one of the big challenges that is there for us is, how are we going to deal with some of these issues? We have tried to do economic reforms, some of the long-standing reforms, and that will help us in the recovery from the pandemic. And, we can deal with that in question answers. I don't want to take too much of my time, just want to briefly cover my, broad issues that I want to address. And I think finally, the third big challenge I want to refer to is climate change. And there's a lot of pressure on India to make commitments on emissions. What India did commit in Paris in 2015 was to have 40% of its generation capacity, energy generation capacity, as being renewable. And India is on track on that target. But only 10% of the generation of power is from renewables. So to translate the capacity that we have created for renewables into actual generation means a lot of policy change, and it's going to be hard because we have a lot of difficulties in the power sector, and we are going to have to deal with those difficulties. Our Indians, where 2/3 of whom have incomes below $2 a day, about 800 million people with below $2 a day of income, are they going to be made to pay for the more expensive renewable capacity, or is the developed world going to pay for or help us in the cost? Particularly because it's unfair to make those who are not responsible for the warming pay for it. But those are very big challenges, and the world needs to figure out how to address this. And India itself cannot figure this out because of the huge costs and the very, very high levels of poverty, which will make it very untenable. So with that, I've already taken 9 minutes. So I think I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doctor. Dr. Abdulaziz Sagar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the invitation to be with amongst colleagues and friends here. I think the previous speaker, she did cover a lot of the economic dimension side. I'm much more interested, of course, on the multilateral side, which is the relation between India and GCC. But I would still go back to some of the key points where I can say vaccination is the biggest problem. I don't think we are at the recovery stage now. This is only a beginning, and the goal for the World Health Organization or the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank, they wanted to see 40% of the globe, each country had been vaccinated in this year, 2021, and then hopefully by 2022, they will see 70%. Unfortunately, that is not possible. Some country, according to their economic ability and financial resources, they have been able to achieve, such as my country, Saudi Arabia. But there are many other countries that far from reaching even 5% of vaccination. So I think, and this is a disease that you cannot stop it. It can move easy between countries. I mean, yesterday, only in China, one of the town with 4 million people, because there were tens of cases, they had to lock it down, stop the airport, stop the flight, make sure that town has an isolation. So without reaching the target or reaching the level that we wanted to see, and country to help other to be able to achieve such a target, I don't think we are going to see a quick and speedy recovery. Second, yes, there are some indication of some recovery somewhere, maybe in certain big economic country that they're going back to pre-COVID-19. But I think the recovery is going to take a much longer. Going back to those figures, prior to COVID-19, yes, we can see it in some of the cases. We can see it in some of the stock market. We can see it in some of the economic indicators. But I think recovery is going to take much longer in terms of period to do. There was a different policies in different country in how to handle and how to do, how to deal with it in terms of compensation, in terms of financial support, in terms of all the dimensions. But there is a very important factors that play globally, which is China-US relation and how is that impacting and affecting, many of the global issues nowadays. And without seeing a better and more sensible, approach between both, I think we're still going to see, difficulty. On the inflation side, yes, food was increased by 30% at least. The cost of transportation, as the previous speaker, she was mentioning cost of logistic, transportation, insurance, a lot of the cost of production. We have seen different sectors have really went extremely. They closed down in food and beverages, in some of the tourism industry, aviation. If you count the losses of the aviation companies worldwide, it's huge. So there is a lot of losses. I don't think there will be a speedy recovery for that. And again, we start seeing in the inflation side, increase of the prices, even domestically in Saudi Arabia. The flight that used to cost 2,000 now is almost at the price of 4,000. The regional flight also, the international flight, they're all, the prices are going and increasing there. So if we don't achieve the target of really a good vaccination, if there is no real clear policies in terms of dealing with the economic difficulties that different countries are facing, in case if we don't fill the gap of the $20 billion required, to move forward on those one, I think it will still, we're not going to see really a speedy, changes or real, changes. It might be much more slower. People are tired, they just want to move ahead, but at the same time, moving ahead, it's not going to happen overnight. It will take, much more longer time and than what is really expected. I will be happy, of course, later on to touch on the issues of the, India-GCC relation. That's a much more closer subject to my heart. So we'll talk about it on the, second round of session. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much, Dr. Abdelaziz. I have a question concerning inflation. Do you think now, with the inflation increasing around the world, is it persistent inflation, or is it a cycle, long-term cycle inflation, or is it just related with COVID, and then central banks shouldn't worry about it too much to reverse the course of policy? Because now the world is facing these two contradictory issues, either to concentrate to the issue of inflation, and then they have to reverse policies. Probably it will harm the economy because we are not yet finished with the recovery. That's the question to Dr. Ila, if you can reflect on this issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. It's actually a very challenging question, because initially we all thought that this was supply constraints, and that once supply constraints ease, we should be able to get inflation back down, and we'll be really not using too much of, not tightening monetary policy, because growth is still not back. GDP is still not back at the previous levels, so we can't afford to do that. So there was both, we kind of convinced ourselves that the inflation is transitory and it'll go away and we don't need to do much on policy. But what has started happening is that once global inflation is increasing, I think that relationship, that our thinking that we can do something about it through our domestic policy goes away. Now, the only way that as a country, so I think a part of the problem is that the huge unemployment benefits and transfer payments that were made in the US really kicked up consumer demand. And so it happened, in two rounds. It happened prior to the presidential election in Q2 2020, and then in Q1 2021, post the presidential elections, again, there was a huge round of transfer payments. As some people are calling it the Great Resignation, where a lot of the, even though there are job vacancies in the US, people are not coming back to work, and they are preferring to take unemployment benefits and stay at home. So I think as long as US fiscal policy and transfer payments are very high, and they also have an effect on increasing global demand very hugely, because if you look at the composition of consumption for the US households, it's gone up hugely and is continuing to go up very, very sharply of their goods consumption. It almost looks like a vertical line, how sharply it is increasing. I think that as long as that does not come under control, there's very little that countries like ours, like India, can do. I mean, if we start raising rates, then we'll end up squeezing our own GDP and output without actually being able to affect much of global inflation. The only other way one could think of is that we try to achieve that through rupee appreciation to offset some of the impact of the global inflation. But rupee appreciation will not be good for our exports. And currently exports is one source of demand that we have. So I think at the moment, until US fiscal policy and their unemployment dole policy changes back to earlier levels of far, more cautious policies, I think that we are going to be facing this inflation challenge. So it's persistent, not because of the supply issues, but it is becoming persistent because of global factors. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Dr. Abdulaziz, most GCC countries, when the COVID began since 2020, it was double affected by the decline of the oil prices, and most of the countries registered deficits in either in balance of payment or in their budget. Do you think that the rally of the oil prices lately will be enough to redress the economic situation in GCC?
It's a great question, but I'm sure we don't have a very clear answer at this stage. A lot of the global report in terms of energy demand, it's increasing, and there's a deficiency in terms of supply, so that bring the possibility. If you read some of the Goldman Sachs report, for instance, they said it can reach to $100 before the end of the year, which is good, for the to recover some of the losses or some of the deficit that have been created due to the cheap oil prices and also the demand on the COVID-19 and all the measures that the government have taken. I think it will help, but I'm not so sure if the oil prices level decline, how that is going to affect. I'm sure we will go back to some deficit situation. So I think it needs to be managed quite carefully. Not to become overconfident and then overreact and overspend, but at the same time, make sure that, reduction of debt exposure will be very important for Saudi Arabia and also for the rest of the Gulf countries. And, as you have seen, some of the Gulf countries have helped the other, to overcome this problem. I don't think the GCC country are in the mood to increase their debt to GDP. So they wanted to reduce it to basically maintain, a global rating, which is very important for them, and also to try to maintain a level of economic growth. Yes, there is a lot of privatization taking place, but also FDI is not coming at the same level that was expected by the different country in the region.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I have only one question, last question, but it is probably not economics, but it has an implication on the economics. The success of the UK in the vaccination, because they start early and achieved nearly universal vaccination, but the pattern of the virus is increasing because the scientists they say immunity is waning out after 6 months. Does this represent a danger of going back to the 2020 situation? Dr. Eli, if you can.
Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm not expert in this, but I can tell you when they offered the third injection, I took it, because I wanted to avoid any complication. My mother, she had both vaccinated, and she took COVID-19 or the corona from the hospital, one of the best hospitals in Saudi Arabia, and she was vaccinated, twice. So, we don't know how that is going to go. And again, it's a bit complicated, to see. But a country like the US, for instance, 30 million people have not been vaccinated. So it's the danger of recurrent and the danger of going back to something, maybe it's still there. Yeah. Sorry, Dr. Ning. Yes.
So, I just like to add, I don't think, I hope there is no danger of going back because vaccines have come. Earlier it was a time when hospitals were full. I mean, we've seen that situation when hospitals were full, when people were dying. At least every day one heard of 2-3 people one knew in the family, everywhere where people were dying. But today, that after the vaccination, I mean, we've had a very rapid vaccination program. After the vaccination, that hasn't happened. And if there is a third vaccine which is offered, at least I can say that in India, we don't have any anti-vaxxers. We don't have these big protests, nothing. I mean, once a vaccine comes, we all go take the vaccine. It's about, of course, the supply, the delivery of vaccines, and that has been pretty rapid. So at least, we hope that now that science has caught up, whether they give us a third booster, a fourth booster, as many boosters as they like, I think we'll take them because we're all scared of what we saw. And, everybody feels that it's better to take the vaccine regardless of whatever little side effects it may have. So I think scientists have delivered on this and that they will keep trying, and the virus, I'm sure, will try and find a way, but I think we'll succeed. I hope so.
I hope so. Okay, so if Mr. Anil, do you want to say a word, Ambassador?
Well, on this specific question, I think I don't have much to add to Dr. Patnaik. She's already told you about the situation which exists in India. I think India has done quite well by way of the enormous job of vaccination, because the amount of people, 1 billion people have already been vaccinated, and the pace has been quite rapid, and that's the reason why we feel a little more confident today that we will probably not have that third wave which we anticipated earlier before reaching this milestone. And that's only because of the rapid ramp up in vaccination, which has happened practically over the last 2 months at this pace. So if this pace continues, I think there is a great hope for the future. But I think in terms of the economy coming back, again, as Dr. Patnaik pointed out, there's been a marked change from the mood and the despondency which was there about a year ago to what it is now, because of the various indicators that we see in the economy and the investments which are taking place, the mood which is very buoyant, especially as far as the investment side is concerned. The stock markets have done very well in India in particular. And the foreign portfolio investors have also come in a big way. But that shows the confidence in the Indian economy and the basic fundamentals. But more important than that, I think it's also the foreign investment into manufacturing, coupled with what has happened by way of governmental schemes like the PLI scheme in particular, which is focused on manufacturing, which offers some incentives for investors. You apply for licensing for manufacturing, for example, and then over a certain period of time, you get incentives by way of land and taxation. And that is what has actually created a better mood as far as these 13 to 17 sectors are concerned. Going forward, I think there'll be more such schemes. Plus, there's a huge program in India today of divestment, and also a program by which the government wants foreign investors to come into certain sectors which were not open. There's been a big investment into Air India, which is the state-run airline. That has created a certain momentum of its own. So, people are looking at the economy with different eyes, even though there may not be a very big fundamental change in terms of the fundamentals, but there's certainly a buoyancy of mood and a certain amount of confidence which is coming in the economy. So that gives us a certain amount of confidence that going forward, things will be much, much better.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Ambassador. To close this part of the discussion, I have a question from the participant. The question says, how can India and GCC work with IMF and World Bank and G20 and other multilateral to secure help for economic recovery? Any thought about this, Dr. Ila?
Well, I think India in particular does not, if it's about recovery in the Indian economy, then India does not need at the moment any particular support from IMF or World Bank. But if it is about the global economy, then yes, India is party to and willing to cooperate in various forums, including, for example, the G20, which was mentioned in the question. And, there are many challenges that as countries together look at. For example, we spoke of climate change and the challenges that faces, and the G20 has a role to play. Some role is there even for the World Bank and other multilateral banks, because, the finance is now becoming green finance, and India certainly has a role to play there. But in particular, I think at the moment, we're not exactly looking for domestically for help from the bank or the fund.
Okay, thanks very much. Dr. Abdulaziz, what about GCC? I know GCC, they don't have IMF programs, but usually IMF produce, especially according to Article 4 consultation, different policies that are not usually taken by GCC, especially when they call about diversifying government revenues, including taxes. Usually they don't take echo inside GCC. So what do you think?
Well, it has been taking very well in Saudi Arabia. We moved from 5% as it was agreed amongst the GCC country. And during the COVID-19, the government decided to increase the VAT from 5 to 15%. So I think that is already there. And they're imposing a much more control on money transfer, on the financial issue and land taxes. Now you pay 5% in any land transaction that is taking place in Saudi Arabia. So I think some of the old advice that IMF used to give to countries that they used to hate those advices, I think, this time because of the financial situation and because of diversification. I mean, the 2030, 2040, 20, whatever is 35 in the Gulf, different plan, different period. I think it's basically focused on reducing dependency in oil and increasing diversification. Diversification means you need to allocate different resources and look at that one, but at the same time also encourage privatization, public-private partnership, program. And we start seeing that moving. It takes some time because, in my opinion, in the region, all this ambitious long-term plan, they do face challenges of legislative issues. You need to change a lot of legislation. They do face a challenge of building capacity. You need to build a lot of capacity domestically here to be able to deal with all these challenges. And it also faces the challenges of geopolitical situation in the region and how things are developed. We live in a very, active region in a way or another. And also oil prices play a very important role. They're all oil producer and gas producer. So energy prices play a role also of how they can achieve all this, ambitious target, visions and so on.
Thanks very much. By this very enlightening remarks, I end the first part of our discussion. Our second part of the discussion is examining India and GCC FTA, for foreign trade agreement, and other trade investment opportunities. We'll put some questions. First, how to resolve the challenges facing India-GCC FTA? What is the role of digitalization, renewable energy, technology, and commodity in trade negotiation and in achieving regional green transition? And how can the trade be made resilient to minimize disruption in regional supply chains from the future global trade? I will give the floor to Mr. Al-Hassan to start this time. From Bahrain. You have the floor.
Thank you. Pleasure to hear my colleagues and to speak. So these are all very important questions. The way I'd like to address them is through more of a geoeconomic. More often, what we do here at the WTO, how some of these trade and investment dynamics spill over into the geopolitical scene and what their underpinnings or implications tend to be. I think it's important to begin with the idea that India really has built a series of bilateral relations in the Gulf region that are underpinned by important economic codependencies or interdependencies. I think the first one that clearly cuts across the board for India is the labor remittances codependency. And that applies for India's bilateral relations with each and every member of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And so obviously the Gulf states are very much dependent on India as a key source of both skilled and unskilled labor. Although it seems that in recent years, the composition of Indian labor migration to the Gulf has been shifting, both geographically within India. And so Kerala is, as a matter of in terms of growth rate, of course, Kerala remains the most important source, but its importance is slightly eroding in favor of other Indian states that are not doing as well economically, such as Bihar and a few other places, especially in the Northeast, for example, that are becoming increasingly represented. In any case, the broader trend also is somewhat of a shift towards the more skilled spectrum of Indian labor migration. So there are important changes there. But again, the big picture is that the labor relationship, the labor codependency, is something that India shares with all of the Gulf countries. And in return, of course, the Gulf becomes an extremely important source of inward remittances to India. So, of course, over 50% of India's total inward remittances flow from the GCC countries. And this is certainly more important in states that are more highly dependent on those migratory linkages to the Gulf than in others. So, yes, there's over 50% for India as a whole, but in places like Kerala, for example, whose economies are far more dependent on the Gulf, that number is bound to be much higher. So this is one codependency that defines India's bilateral relations across the board in the GCC. But there are other codependencies as well. So energy, obviously, is one of them. On the one hand, India relies very largely on imports from the Gulf region. But at the same time, India is also a key export market for the Gulf states. Now, there is the renewable shift and the drive towards clean and renewable energy in India. Clean energy is not that big of a problem because India relies largely on coal to generate power. Natural gas is a cleaner alternative. And the Gulf states, Qatar, for example, is a key exporter of natural gas. So that shift towards clean energy is not necessarily going to harm long-term energy dynamics. The shift towards renewables, on the other hand, I think could potentially impact on the oil and gas relationship. But then again, if you were to look at the International Solar Alliance, for example, that India launched effectively in 2015, all of the GCC states, with the exception of Kuwait and Qatar, are members of that alliance. And of course, countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, are in the midst of a strong push towards renewable energy. And there is something there, and they've already partnered with China quite a bit. So the Chinese are building, for example, the Mohammed bin Rashid solar plant in the UAE. They've acquired, they have a local partner in Saudi Arabia, Aqua, that also invests quite a bit on renewable energy. Perhaps that's also something that the Indians could become a part of. And so the Gulf states are going through their own energy transitions. And so there is perhaps something to be done there. But I think some countries like the UAE, some nations have gone a bit farther in terms of translating these codependencies into something a bit more advanced and a bit more developed. So the UAE, for example, partly underpins its relationship with India on the energy security in exchange for food security equation. So, for example, India's strategic petroleum reserves are notoriously small. India has about 9 days worth of strategic petroleum reserves, and finds it very difficult to attract private, let alone foreign investment into SPRs, because these tend to be commercially unattractive. And yet the UAE has stepped in as the only foreign investor in India's strategic petroleum reserves, with ADNOC playing an important role there. And I think India is now contemplating joining the International Energy Agency, which will likely imply that India will need to increase its strategic petroleum reserves at least tenfold to arrive at a 90-day reserve capability. And there, I think investors such as ADNOC are slated to play a very important role. And in exchange, India, in a sense, contributes to the UAE's, but also to the Gulf states, a broader food security, I think, program. And so India has opened up, presumably, its agribusiness sector to the UAE. The UAE has announced its intention to build a food corridor by trying to invest in cold storage and warehousing and transportation facilities to help reduce food waste in India's agribusiness sector, and to be able to link that sector better into the port infrastructure, better into the trade corridor with the UAE and the rest of the Gulf. So there is an energy security for food security equation that underpins India-UAE ties. The problem is that we often hear of massive announcements of plans to invest tens of billions of dollars. So, for example, we've heard the Saudi Crown Prince announce a $100 billion investment package in India. But I think it's very often these big announcements come across and encounter severe political and regulatory obstacles. There are legacy issues. So, for example, there was the case of the 2G scandal that actually hurt Emirati and Bahraini telecom operators quite massively in India. But there are political obstacles as well. And so, for example, the petrochemical refining complex that was supposed to be co-built by ADNOC and Aramco in Ratnagiri hasn't been able to move forward because of local opposition. And that has inflated the expected cost of the project massively by tens of billions of dollars. And so there are real regulatory and political obstacles that stand in the way of greater Gulf investments in India. But I think the Gulf side has been rather willing to lock India into its own energy sector. And we've seen the UAE offer multiple concessions to Indian oil companies in terms of allowing them exploration rights and whatnot to better lock that buyer-seller relationship on the energy side. So the takeaway here is that there are important codependencies and interdependencies that underpin India's relations with the Gulf states. These have to do with labor, energy, food security, and these are well known. But I think the novelty as of late is that India is now pursuing, or seems to be pursuing, a multi-speed trade policy in the Gulf. And so I think in the past, India's trade discussions with the Gulf bloc proceeded at the pace of the slowest, so to speak. And so, multilateral or plurilateral trade discussions at the GCC level with India have languished for years. This is partly due to the fact that GCC plurilateral trade discussions were interrupted here in general. I think were halted for a good number of years, but they seem to be back online. So we're seeing an acceleration, for example, in China GCC FTA talks. And these seem to be happening at a rather quick pace. We haven't seen the same thing with India. I think there is less of a geopolitical drive to pursue a GCC-wide FTA with India. But I think India is now finding ways to go around that and to proceed bilaterally with partners that are ready to move faster than the rest of the bloc. And so we're seeing an attempt at arriving at what is being called a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, I believe CEPA, with the UAE. It's unclear exactly what that will entail substantively in terms of in trade and investment terms. What are the exact provisions? There isn't a lot of transparency around that, but it seems to be a go-around mechanism for India to be able to engage in some sort of free trade discussion with the UAE without calling it as an FTA. Because if it were to do that, then that obviously contravenes the GCC-wide agreement not to engage in bilateral FTAs, because ultimately the GCC is supposed to be a customs union. And so India seems to be pursuing a multi-speed trade policy, working with partners that are willing to proceed faster than the rest of the bloc. And I think that's partly why we're seeing this attempt at pursuing a bilateral economic agreement with the UAE. I think the final point that I'd like to make is that India will find it nevertheless very difficult to translate these economic arrangements into geopolitical gains, especially vis-a-vis China. So I think India looks, especially given the rise in tensions and the border confrontation with China last year. Obviously, China is now viewed more acutely as a source of threat. And I think India is very much interested in trying to do a bit more to counter China's geoeconomic influence through the BRI initiative, through the Belt and Road Initiative, by trying to propose some alternative arrangements. And so we've seen India participate very enthusiastically in this emerging quadrilateral format with the US, the UAE, and Israel, which seems to be ultimately about economic and infrastructure cooperation. And infrastructure cooperation often is now a polite way of saying countering China's Belt and Road Initiative. India is obviously pushing multiple trade corridors. So there's the international north-south transportation or transport corridor that India is very much a part of, and India is trying to push. So obviously, India's relationship with Iran is extremely important there because of Chabahar, and because ultimately Chabahar port is India's way, is a vital component for the trade corridor that India is trying to construct through Central Asia. We've seen a Central Asia push on the part of the Indian foreign minister, who was in Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and finally in Armenia. Armenia is important because Iran's tensions with Azerbaijan and the interruption of overland trade there means that the Iranians will need to find an alternative route north, and that will most likely happen through Armenia. And I think India is trying to rope Armenia into that architecture as well. I think it's trying to support and facilitate that process. And so but there are obviously big challenges to dealing with Iran, partly because of the US sanctions, partly because Iran is also cultivating China, partly because Iran is a difficult economic partner for India to deal with. There are multiple differences on gas exploration, on Chabahar and other bilateral commercial disputes that have bogged down India's relations with Iran for quite some time. But in any case, that's one trade corridor that India is pushing. There is some, I think, I would call it fantastical speculation about a Indo-Arab Mediterranean corridor that goes from India to Jebel Ali in Dubai, all the way through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and then into the Mediterranean. The problem with such kind of thinking is that India is not really, there isn't a political machine that, and even less so a financial machine that is pushing this. It's not like the BRI, where you have a clear political, diplomatic, institutional, financial apparatus that is working to realize this trans-regional infrastructure connectivity project. With India, it's more about, let's try to find a way to diplomatically align these various actors and hope that they will invest in their respective parts of the chain. Mind you, India is doing more, obviously, on the international north-south transit corridor, right? And so India has invested in Chabahar. It's invested on the Afghanistan link, on the Zaranj-Delaram highway, for example. But I doubt that India, at the moment, has the political willpower to do the same for a corridor that links through to the Gulf and then all the way through across the Levant and into the Mediterranean. So at the moment, I would say this is fantastical thinking, unless India makes it a foreign policy priority and puts the sort of the diplomatic and financial instruments at this disposal. And I think unless India does that, then it will be very hard for India to translate these arrangements geopolitically as a means of countering or containing China's geoeconomic influence in the region. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Dr. Hassan, for this resourceful information about the relation of the Indian and GCC. I give the floor to Ambassador Anil to reflect from the Indian side on what Dr. Hassan was saying.
Thank you. So I think I tend to agree with a lot of what was said by Dr. Al Hassan, because it's a fact that India has been trying, first of all, for this free trade agreement with the GCC for a long time, and then it was put off because of the fact that petroleum and petrochemicals and related products came in the way of proceeding further. And this happened in 2008. I remember that I was posted in Oman for 4 years from 2007 onwards, and I tried very hard to look at how the ways and means in which we could actually revive these negotiations at that point in time. And even though we have a list of products that has been identified, that list, by the way, has not changed much in the trade mix between GCC and India. In fact, what has happened is that we've added to it. We've diversified much more, and what has also happened is that we've added to the areas and services where India has a particular interest because of what was pointed out in terms of the manpower resources that India has across the GCC in all sorts of companies or workers, or so it's ranging from blue collar to white collar workers and different kinds of consultancies which have now spread all across the Gulf, construction companies which are very active over there as well. So what has happened post-COVID in particular is that the world has realized that you have to have resilient supply chains, especially with regard to commodities and issues in which your economy actually depends on others, and therefore there's a move for nearshoring as opposed to offshoring. So India and the GCC are ideally placed in that respect. They're next to each other. There's very good air connectivity between the two countries. But in my opinion, there's a lot to be done by way of sea connectivity, by way of shipping links. And that's a link that needs to be strengthened quite rapidly. In terms of 2-3 other areas that I like to add, which is important, and you mentioned about digitization and renewable energy technologies, etc. Of course, there is a move now across the world, and especially in the GCC and in India, to move towards renewable energy as quickly as possible. We'll see this trend intensify over the next few years, and this is where India and the GCC can actually come together and do well. There is also the issue of digitization, especially digital trade, e-commerce in particular, where India has emerged as a big market and will continue to do so in the future. What was mentioned by Dr. Al-Hassan also in terms of the mutual dependency as far as food security and energy security is concerned will continue to hold good in the future. We will see more investments from both sides going into each other's economies over there. But 2 other areas of which have emerged are those of cooperation in space and in defense manufacturing. That's happened over the past 3 to 4 years, in my view, where both sides have discovered that there are mutual complementarities, and there is much to work on if they can, come together on satellites, for instance, or even on simple defense manufacturing, which requires labor-intensive technology, but also a good environment. And the GCC offers a good environment for that purpose. Also, there's a market which exists in the GCC for Indian defense products if they can be manufactured there. Last point in that context I wanted to mention was about the trade negotiations. Now here, we've seen that, one country or the other has specific issues which come up in the negotiations. So quite rightly has been pointed out, if you're negotiating as a whole with the GCC or as a group, then obviously you've got to take the whole group along. In the current state, the GCC having a one unified view is also a difficult proposition, and that is why these various initiatives have sprung up with the UAE or Oman or other countries. For instance, I'm sure going forward it will be Saudi Arabia as well. But that's because of the new linkages which have been developed between India and these countries. So at the moment, of course, The UAE is a flavor of the season in India because of the no, we don't call it the Quad, but we call it the Quartet, and because just to differentiate it from the Southeast Asian Quad, but there again, as it was pointed out, it's essentially a focus on economics and business and how the businesses can come together and leverage what is there by way of technology in Israel and financing in the UAE and manufacturing capability in India to see which kind of industries, especially to develop resilient supply chains, can come up in the future. It's not just talk in the air, by the way, because there are working groups which have been set up. There's a Sherpa which will guide it, and also the duration and the frequency of these meetings will be set at the next meeting. So there's a certain amount of seriousness going forward into this proposal, and that itself will lend itself into some amount of seriousness in negotiations in a free trade agreement or a SECA, if you might call it, with UAE or the GCC. Of course, India would very much like the whole of GCC to be involved. But lately we've seen that these bilaterals have become a focus for India, be it Australia or be it UAE or even Canada for that matter. The United States is not ready. Otherwise, we could have had a minilateral with the United States, a mini agreement, and that seems to be the focus as far as India is concerned. What is actually required in India today is an infusion of high technology and also capital. And this is what India is looking for in terms of niche areas. And the GCC seems to be able to provide that, at least in certain areas in which it is needed in India. I completely agree with the point made by Dr. Al Hassan about the legacy issues and about the fact that there are some political issues or environmental factors like Ratnagiri refinery, for instance. It's a big investment, but again, to have it in the place where it was actually designated as the place it will come up, that seems to be proving very difficult given the change in local governments, etc. But even so, even the local government at present has agreed that it will be at a place which is close by, not exactly at the spot that it was agreed upon, but it will be, next to that. That has to be finalized going forward. And we have obviously this problem that if you put off a decision, then of course the cost escalation kicks in, and there are other dissatisfactions which kick in. So one has to be very careful in terms of implementation of the decisions which are taken. Now, and the government, of course, is very conscious of it. But at the same time, in a democracy, you have these particular issues which come up from time to time. I think this time around, government in India is very serious about entering into a SECA or an FTA with either with one country, two countries, or with the GCC as a whole. So we will see something emerging in the future. At least there would be some arrangement which will come up by way of resilient supply chains in the area. And the third issue that I wanted to also raise in particular is about the port facilities which are coming up in the Gulf. It's becoming more and more important for India to have turnaround facilities in the Gulf because of the fact that there is supposed to be a presence due to the sea lanes of communication in the area. And that is why India is looking at the island states in particular, and then the littoral states in the GCC. So Oman, for example, has already offered that kind of facility to India, and I'm sure if there are other arrangements that can be worked out, India will be looking at that as well. On Chabahar and connectivity with Central Asia, yes, India has been trying with Iran and Russia, for that for a very long time in order to operationalize this particular route. There was a joint venture between India and Iran in shipping as well, which was functioning pretty well till the US sanctions kicked in. So that venture had to be abandoned, and because of that, we lost some very valuable time. So if the sanctions on Iran are lifted and if we proceed with the JCPOA, then many things can change. If they don't, then the future is quite uncertain in terms of how successful the North-South corridor is going to be. The other complicating factor as far as the Indian situation is concerned is the relationship between India and the neighboring GCC states, some of them in particular, where there are still lingering disputes and suspicions, etc., especially over backing of different factions and sides in Iran, in Yemen, for example. And then the dispute within the GCC, which had come up in the past with regard to Qatar, which now is being tried, in countries in the GCC are trying to mend, but still not settled fully. So we have that added problem looking at it from the perspective of countries like India, who have a good relationship, a good working relationship, and good political relationship with all the countries in the GCC at the moment. So sometimes it becomes very difficult to balance off one interest against the other. A final point that I'd like to make is about the benefits that will accrue if this comes about. I think in terms of trade, investments, and services, trade, of course, is doing all right. It could do better, but then, and also I would say that as far as the Gulf is concerned, and UAE in particular, which is the biggest trade partner for India, the duties in the UAE are already quite low. So trade would, of course, benefit, but not to that extent of investments. So if we have a comprehensive agreement, for instance, the investment side would benefit the most, perhaps. And then coupled with that, if there's a services arrangement as well, which comes about, then we will see a huge movement of people, specialists, for example, who can work from India into the Gulf and also vice versa. If there are specialists in oil industry, for example, or other specialized industries where India needs that kind of expertise. And in terms of warehousing and storage for oil facilities, there's a lot of work to be done in India. There's also a lot of work bilaterally in terms of food and energy security. Food security as far as the Gulf is concerned, energy security as far as India is concerned. So both ways we are going to see much more investments if this comes about in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Abdulaziz, you.
Okay, I think, since the important visit in 2016, 2019, particularly when we talk about Saudi Arabia and India, and also the rest of the Gulf country, we have seen a great improvement. But I would like to add to the different point that has been discussed. At the Saudi side, with India, now we have this strategic partnership, and Saudi probably is the fourth country signing with India, because India, they have it with France and also with UK, but and Saudi Arabia now. There's two tracks there. There is the political track headed by the two foreign ministers, and there is the commercial and the economic track, which is headed by the energy and the Minister of Commerce, which we start seeing a big improvement. And when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said there's $100 billion, potential investment from Saudi and India, I think it's, it might be an ambition, but at the same time, I can see already some progress in that one. If you consider some of the negotiations taking place, with regard to technology and with the companies, they have been talking about it there. I think it also sends an important signal. But the former head of Aramco, he used to say India will be the most important energy market for Saudi Arabia. But today we see a challenge, because also for the rest of the Gulf countries, by the way, it's almost around 65 to 68% of our export of energy goes to India, China, Japan, South Korea. These are the major buyers. The challenge today, we see it also in the US-China relation. Saudi, they do export about 1.7 million barrels a day to China. US-China relation is not as good. US trying to convince India that they can be a supplier of energy also to them at the same price being bought from Saudi Arabia. So that's also brings some of the challenges on the relation. It used to be before more of a political Kashmir, Pakistan, and so, but no longer those political issues and it was very clear policy from Saudi Arabia that we do differentiate. This is an internal matter between India and Pakistan. We're not going to leverage anything like this on the economic and bilateral relation from both sides. But on the counterterrorism, of course, there's a great collaboration. On Navy also, there is a great collaboration. In fact, now the the Saudi Indian Navy, they do have a good collaboration in protecting vessels and maritime security, and also during the issue. The other issue, in my opinion, also that will also is important for both sides is the relation with Afghanistan, Iran also. And, today this is also an important element, is taking place. But you can see the economic relation is growing. The potentiality is there. In total, now we have more than 9 million Indian in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, I believe, is about 2.1 million out of that number. So it's the largest foreign community in Saudi Arabia, is the Indian community. The growth in terms of trade relations, Saudi today is the fifth largest or fifth important, trade partner to India. So we can see all that. But future-wise, I still believe food is an important. Technology, of course, will be very important. Energy, clean energy, and environmental issues will really play the key subject, between both sides there. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dr. Abdulaziz. Lastly, I would like to give the floor to Chanvi.
Thank you, sir. It's always burdensome going last. I'll try to be brief and unique. Before I start, a point that Dr. Al-Hassan made on how a CEPA differs from an FTA, I think in the Indian parlance, and if you look at the Indian perspective, they think of CEPAs as deeper agreements because they allow for sort of regulatory agreements in addition to FTA-like arrangements. So you can have mutual recognition agreements on standards and on rules of origin, etc. Those are part of FTAs as well, but they're more comprehensive in CEPAs. Coming to my own analysis on the international perspective, there are various reasons that it makes economic sense for India to get into an FTA with our West Asian partners at this stage. In recent times, we have left the RCEP negotiations. We have been rehauling and reviewing all of our FTAs. We are re-engaging with all of the FTA partners and negotiations that have been stalled for a long time. And while this is happening, China is obviously part of the RCEP and has also requested admission to the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So in that context, for India to have stable trade partners closer home, and in a context where we have comparative advantages rather than competitive advantages, it makes a lot more sense for India to be focusing on the India-GCC partnership at this stage. According to experts, the CEPA is expected to increase merchandise trade by about $100 billion in the next 5 years, services trade by about $15 billion, because it will lead to a level of trade facilitation that doesn't exist at the moment. And if you look at the International Trade Center's export potential map, untapped potential with the UAE alone is at about $10.1 billion. So having eased regulations, having open or lower tariffs on goods that are of mutual benefit and need is just economically viable, regardless of the politics of it all. If we also compare the top 20 to 25 products that India and the GCC trade in, we find that there are a lot of commonalities in the HS chapters in which this trade is occurring. So one of two things is possible. Either there's a lot of re-exports that are taking place, or there's already a value chain established where we are procuring raw materials or sending raw materials. There is value addition happening in the respective economies, and then there's re-export happening for the final product. So if that value chain already exists, tapping into it is economically viable for both the GCC and India, given we are both aiming towards diversification of our export basket, because the GCC's oil dependence is well known, and it needs to move into greener energy as well, in addition to digitalization, while India is trying to move into mid-tech and high-tech exports. Additionally, if we look at the digitalization component of it, India in the next week or so is expecting to come out with regulations on e-commerce. It is expecting to come out with regulations on how digital trade occurs. And why is this important? Besides mode 4 services trade, which has been discussed already, where there's movement of natural persons, there's also been an increase in mode 1 services trade due to the pandemic, where cross-border supply is occurring over the internet. And a lot of, say, if we were to send a consultant for infra project to a GCC nation, instead that is happening online. So the remittance that comes on that particular transaction becomes the mode 1 service supply. So the rules that come up for mode 1 trade will also become important in any new FTA, and therefore the India-GCC relationship. Besides that, FTAs in general are likely to bring stability and market access in addition to technology transfer. It is something India is recognizing and therefore aiming for more transparency in rules. And stable rules help businesses. The more stable trade environment or a trade policy system, better it is for businesses, because it creates the political risk reduces. So in spite of what is happening politically everywhere, we know that these are the rules and we play by those rules. I'll stop here, and because we're short on time, and we can go on to questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your contribution. We still have less than a quarter of an hour. One question, I'm not specialist of trade between GCC and India, but from the rapid readings, I found out that despite the opportunities, the great opportunity of trading between the two blocks, some operators from the GCC put the blame on high non-trade barriers put by India, especially very strict and severe anti-dumping practices. Anyone to reflect on this? Mr. Hassan?
I'm no more an expert on India-GCC trade than you are, but I think in addition to anti-dumping practices, I think that there's also a severe concern about the ability to repatriate capital. And I think that, I've heard personally from people that decide on, that play a role in formulating trade and investment policy in the GCC, is that concerns on the ability to repatriate capital and funds and profits. The extent of capital controls that exist in India are also a big barrier for greater investments. So perhaps that is something, hopefully, that future FTA negotiations could look at. I did want to come in on a few things that were said, if I may. I think ultimately the driver for an India-GCC FTA, I think, is trickier potentially than say a China-GCC FTA. With China, obviously there are issues, acute issues on petrochemicals, on aluminum, because there is a fair degree of competition there, and so market access and is an issue, of course. With India, I think the labor element is politically trickier for the Gulf states to navigate, because you start going into because the Indian community is a very big one in the Gulf states, and in certain Gulf states, the expatriates are more numerous than citizens, and so issues that have to do with regulating the presence of foreign workers become politically difficult to deal with become a national security issue. And that's something we've seen in Kuwait, for example. Kuwait is one country that has that views its demographic composition as a national security issue, and has been actually quite forthcoming in saying, and actually quite explicitly has said that it wants to manage the demographic composition of Kuwait more actively because of the perceived economic, but also security risk. And so I think there is that angle that also, in my view, could be another complicating factor for potential free trade negotiations. But I'm thankful to John V for kindly shedding light on the difference in the Indian perspective between what an FTA and a comprehensive agreement stand for.
Thanks very much. Ambassador?
So just 2 or 3 issues that came up in the discussion, which I wanted to comment on. One was the labor element. It is an issue, as far as some countries are concerned. But we've seen now that there is a trend, both in the Gulf countries, to sort of try and see if more and more local population can be involved in the workforce, and this is a big attempt which is consistently being made. And on the other hand, we also see that as far as India is concerned, the amount of labor which was going out as workers is coming down, and that's because you have alternate places to work here now in India. And as we go forward, as manufacturing in the Indian economy picks up, then obviously there will be more of a tendency to stay at home and try and work closer to home, except the state of Kerala, where it is obviously used to be a prestige issue to go and work in the Gulf rather than work 10 kilometers away from your home place. So that's something we can discount. This is something which used to happen in the past, but no longer so. Second issue was about the issue about how do we deal with the perception that we have about tougher regulations as far as India is concerned. Now, we've seen over the past 2 to 3 years that this current government has tried a lot to bring about certain amount of reforms in the ease of doing business, and progressively the ranking of India in ease of doing business has been improving steadily. It's actually improved quite a bit over the past few years, and that's precisely because there's a certain amount of intent behind making sure that investors who are in India can actually feel much more comfortable in terms of these kind of issues. So a repatriation of your proceeds of profit, for instance, or making it easier for companies to operate within the country, which will have a long way to go. But what it used to be, we've seen definitely a big change, and it continues to happen as we go along. And then there are issues of the labor in India itself, which I wanted to comment on, because currently India is engaged in a big labor reform, and obviously there is a certain amount of approvals which are required for a big change to come about, but it is very much in the thinking and very much on the anvil. So if there are foreign investors who would come in to India, I mean, they can look forward to a change circumstances as far as the Indian working environment is concerned for the future. So that's all I wanted to say. I think there are also some misperceptions about anti-dumping issues. Now, having been in the Gulf myself, I know that sometimes these are misplaced because there are two sides to it. I mean, there are companies who are in India feel that there is a genuine problem here because their business is being affected, whereas the companies who actually export in large volumes feel that there should not be constraints on how much they're selling and at what prices they're selling. So it's always a balance, and one has to maintain that balance and make sure that the atmosphere is such that it is a good working relationship. But the FTA or the SECA would be a good platform to tackle these issues.
Okay, thanks very much. We have about 5 to 6 minutes. There is a second question I would like to ask very quickly. When we talked about the renewable energy, we didn't mention the new revolution in hydrogen, especially what is called blue hydrogen, that is extracted from natural gas. And the expectation that with the net zero policies, demand for hydrogen will increase. The question is to Dr. Abdulaziz. Do you consider that hydrogen production from natural gas in GCC as an opportunity to further enhance trade and to export to India, given the need of India in energy that is huge and it has to shift to new energies in the future?
I must admit I'm not the best expert in renewable energy, but I'm sure I can refer back to some of our researchers because we did a big program in clean energy. But of course, I mean, in principle, yes, it will increase. I mean, India is more interested to buy. I think the notion in the Gulf in general, particularly in Saudi Arabia and UAE, by investing in India, they would like to invest on the independent power plant, instead of supplying oil or gas, they wanted to build themselves, a power plant and then supply electrowatt to the market, linked to the grid there, and provide that since they are the supplier of the feedstock. Because still there is an estimate of, I don't know the exact figure, but it's a huge figure that, in India that they don't have access to electricity. And that makes it a very lucrative market and an interesting market, for, power companies to produce. And Aramco, with Aqua Power, where they, the BIF, the Saudi Investment Fund, have invested heavily in, companies to go outside and invest in independent power plant. I think that's more the direction. But of course, in the hydrogen now, we start seeing, more companies investing in Saudi Arabia. We start seeing the trend is moving far more on the clean energy. And, Saudi just hosted a big meeting in Riyadh on the green Middle East and green Saudi, and trying to deal with the issue of the environment, putting a target on 2060, to have, achieved all the goals that, it was stated on the statement. Yes, it's very ambitious, but let's hope that they can achieve that.
Okay, thanks, Ron. On this nice contribution by you, ladies and gentlemen, we finished our time. I think I will give the floor to Akshay to say a concluding word, if he's listening to me.
All that's left for me to do is to thank the experts for joining us today. I just welcome everybody who's listening in. Particularly, I see that there were many people joining us from the Gulf that we here at the Observer Research Foundation, that's based in Delhi, but the ORF Mumbai Center look forward to building an institutional partnership, especially on some of these policy issues. So please stay plugged in, and we hope that we can engage further. So thank you.
Okay. That's right.
Thank you.
Okay, from my part, I would like to thank you, all of you, for your very thoughtful contribution, very informative, and I hope to join you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.